All right, today we're going to start chapter 5, interviewing. Now, an interview can serve a few different purposes. In the case of media writing, we're often looking to use interviews to fill in gaps in our information. So maybe we received a press release about something, but we want to interview another person involved in the situation, maybe get some additional information from them, or possibly add a face to those facts that we've already received about our particular topic. So if let's say we're talking about an event where there's a hurricane, or if we're talking about a school board meeting and how it's going to impact the students or the teachers who are involved, then we can get this other person on tape and have them be one of the faces for that particular story. And it helps to humanize the story. It adds that extra element for our audience so they can connect one on one with somebody in there, other than hearing a bunch of statistics or other things about what's going on. And this can also help us to balance our coverage as well. Often, when we're dealing with either the government or a large corporation or some other entity, they might be sending out more official press releases or emails or have people available for public speaking engagements, but we want to have some additional people involved as well. You want to go out and actually look for someone. Don't just sit back and wait for everyone to come to you. You have to do a little bit of legwork, and collecting interviews is part of it. Now, in everyday life, you do have certain kinds of interviews that happen. For example, whenever you apply for a job, people interview you. They are asking you questions and trying to get a sense of who you are away from what they see on the paper or what they read in your application. Also, when you have daily discussions with people, when you talk to your parents, or if you're talking about a project with an instructor, there is a kind of interviewing that's happening every day in those interactions where you're discussing these things, and maybe either you have questions for them, like if you're talking about a project that you have coming up, or you're like in the case of family members, a lot of times they'll ask you, hey, how was school? How was everything going? They're usually genuinely interested in what you're and how everything's going, and they want you to fill in those gaps in information, whether or not they may see report cards and things like they did in elementary school with you. All right, so let's talk about how you can find someone to interview. Now, whenever you conduct an interview, you are the interviewer, and the person you are interviewing is the interviewee. And the types of people you choose will help you fill different types of story gaps in your work. So you might look for someone, first of all, who has a professional understanding of your topic. This could be someone who is a field expert. For example, if you speak to a therapist about the trend of online therapy, or maybe someone who works in that particular field. Like if you are interviewing people about local restaurants and you want to talk to someone who works in the kitchen somewhere or who's on the wait staff or something, those would be different types of professionals who could give you different points of view on your particular topic. You can also look for people who have more personal relationships with a topic. For example, if there's a flood and someone's house flooded, then you might interview them so people get a more real sense, instead of hearing a statistic like 600 homes flooded in this area, or that this number of people were affected by something, or like in the case of, of the pandemic or of other situations where there are large groups of people involved, it can be hard for us as people to really understand those numbers. But whenever you add a person, an example of someone who's been affected, it can help your audience to connect with what's going on. Now, choosing an interviewee, you want to first of all consider some of your timelines. How much time do I have to finish this project, to work on these things? And that may affect how many people you reach out to or who you reach out to. So, you want to think about the accessibility of someone. So, are you able to get in touch with this person? Another example would be if you're looking at something that's more of a national story, then at this particular moment, I would imagine you as a student are not going to be able to get in touch with the president per se or another larger level government official. So instead, you would look for someone else who is affected or is part of the story. Like maybe you could even look at, if you're doing a story on politics, look at local officials, see what's going on around town, and get their phone numbers, their email. You can drop by people's offices sometimes and see what they're doing, if they're open to the idea of an interview. And you'd be surprised how many people, especially the mid-level workers in government, who are open to the idea of being interviewed, especially spur of the moment type things. So it may not be quite as impossible as it sounds to get some of those people. And all you do is you reach out and you try, and if they say no, then you tell them thank you very much and move on to the next person on your list. Now, you can also interview people who have some kind of personal relationship with you. Sometimes those people do work well for a particular story. For example, you could interview a friend if you're both students at UL and you're talking about an issue with student government, or if maybe they're in a fraternity or sorority and there's some special event going on with them. Or you could talk to a family member. Maybe their particular line of work works well with the topic you're discussing. Or you could even ask an acquaintance so someone that maybe you don't know quite as well, but you know well enough that if you contact them, they'll say, "Oh yeah, hey I'll I'll be happy to answer your questions about this topic," or maybe that if they can't, they'll direct you to someone who can. So, yeah, don't be afraid to look outside your comfort zone when you're looking for someone to interview, especially if you're continuing on in journalism or broadcasting. You'll need to start like reaching out to people and practicing that kind of one-on-one connection. So, whenever you're conducting an interview, you want to be prepared. And this doesn't necessarily mean you have to write out every single thing that you're going to discuss in the interview. In fact, often that is not the case. You go into the interview after reviewing your topic, searching for main ideas, collecting basic information about the person you're interviewing, so understanding who they are, how they relate to the topic, and that way you ask them questions that they can actually answer, and you have more things that you can discuss with them if you have more of a conversation about that particular topic. And it is better to conduct more than one interview. So think about who you can interview, reach out to two or three people and expect one or two maybe to get back to you. Sometimes you have to reach out to four or even five people before you really find someone who will be able to provide the information that you need. So it's important to get started early and to have backups. Sometimes people cancel at the last minute, whether it's because they decide not to do the interview in general, or maybe they really do have an emergency and they're unable to do it. So you want to have backup people and of course, be prepared by researching the topic and having a few specific questions in mind. All right, now take a second and think about one interview you watched or heard, whether it was something in a podcast or on YouTube, or maybe something on like in a traditional broadcast, either radio or TV format. So, what did they discuss? How were those questions asked? How were the people included in the story? So, something you may have noticed is often there are at least two people who are involved in a story. There are occasions where this isn't the case. Sometimes with crime or fast events like emergency events and things, you might have a fire official or a particular spokesperson or something who appears, but maybe at first you don't see another person, but later on, if it's a big enough story, they'll usually interview more people and include that kind of back and forth between all of the groups involved. All right, so now that we've talked about people that you might interview, let's talk about your pre-interview research. Now, whenever you're researching your topic, you also, of course, need to research your interviewee. And there are lots of different sources available nowadays. Some of them will be online, some of them you may have to find in person. And some of the places you can look are, of course, news organizations, see what they've already covered, and that can give you a jumping off point for your own work. Same thing with press releases, company blogs, and websites. You can use those press releases as a starting point and include information from them in your work, and then build off of that with the information that you collect from your interview. And of course, peer-reviewed journals are another great source depending on what kind of topic you're discussing. And social media pages can be another thing. So if you're talking about something that's happening right now and a lot of people are talking about it on Instagram, or maybe you were able to download some Snapchat videos or something, you can include that type of media in your work, especially when we talk about certain types of news reporting. And also other like in-person examples could be things like posters. If you look around campus, you'll see there are bulletin boards full of posters and advertisements for things in the student union. And they still have some on some of the light and telephone poles as well. You also will see lots of billboards whenever you're driving, and those can be inspiration points as well. Maybe you notice that all of a sudden they have more ads for something. For example, I heard someone the other day who was talking about all of the new Buc-ee's poster, the Buc-ee's billboards that are out along the highway, since we're about to get one in Lafayette. And then there's another one that just finished being built nearby. So there are more billboards along the highway. And yeah, so that could be another discussion point. Now, of course, you also have lots of university and government resources. If you look at the UL library, remember all of those resources that the librarian showed us where you can look up either online or in person, books, periodicals. So that's like magazines, newspapers, and stuff that are online, or maybe they have book collections of them. If you're looking at some older articles, maybe for a trend of some kind, maybe reports of certain types of events that all of a sudden start appearing at a certain point, or there are a lot more of them. You could also look at journal articles, and of course, we have lots of government resources as well. And most of those local and national government websites will have .gov or .edu endings on them. Some of them now do have .com as well. And whenever you look up local resources, especially so something not at the state level, but at the parish level or at the city level, you might be limited to social media pages. Some governments really don't have enough money to support their own website, so they've been taking advantage of free pages like Facebook pages and stuff, and using those to distribute information to people. Now, of course, if you do use a social media site as your government resource, then you definitely want to review it as well as you can and make sure that this actually is what it says it is. There have been instances where a web page was created, especially on Twitter during certain points, where they were proven later to be fraudulent accounts. Now, after you find your sources, you want to review publication dates, and you want to see when was it published. So it may change whether or not it's a good source for your particular story. For example, if you're focusing on something that's happening right now, then a news article from 10 years ago might not be the best source to use, especially if you're only using that and an interview, or that and a maybe a press release or something that will probably be too old. Uh, so when you look at news sources, unless you're looking up something where you're going to explain a pattern that's happening, then you might have some of those older articles. Otherwise, you want to stick to things that have been more recently published. So think about that and how it relates to whatever topic you're discussing. Now, whenever we look at journal articles or other periodicals that are only printed maybe once a year or every couple of years, your more recent source for it might be a little later. So it could be something from a year ago and be from a peer-reviewed journal and still be relevant enough to work for an article about something that's happening right now. And again, whenever you're looking up sources, check and see how many primary sources you can find. So look for those primary sources of information. And if you can't find enough relevant ones, of course, you can use secondary sources. Just make sure that it's something that's very relevant and you cannot find the primary sources elsewhere. All right. So it's time to talk about a scenario. Let's say you're writing a story and it's about the new CC's Coffee CEO. Where might you find more information about this person? And where might you find more information about why they were hired? So, why is there a new CEO? Oh, right. So now that you thought about it for a second, of course, one of the first places you might look would be on the CC's website. You want to see if they sent a press release, what was in the press release first, and then you, if if there's a if there's a public meeting, maybe a public announcement about it where they're allowing members of the press to go and ask questions and stuff. You could ask those questions over there. And another thing would be now this would be an instance where maybe if you look back to a month or 2 or 3 months ago and you see that there was a story about the CC's coffee shares dropping, so the maybe the price of the company went down and there were some other things going on that made the CEO not seem like a very good choice anymore and that they wanted to replace them, then you could include that information as well. And if again you go to a conference or something and listen to them, you can see what they say, the people who are answering questions and stuff, like the new CEO or maybe a board member or somebody, ask them what's going on. Okay. Now we've talked about finding our interviewee. We've discussed looking for your relevant sources. Now let's talk about your pre-interview writing. So you want to ask yourself, what is my story? And this is where that concept of working on your lead, starting with your lead, comes into play. And this will help you to figure out what makes this story newsworthy and what kind of information do I need to improve this story and make it better for my audience. And you want to outline your story. So jot down some notes, collect your background information. This could be documents, online posts, maybe a web page with additional information about your interviewee or about your topic. And you want to use, personally, I like doing kind of bullet lists or maybe a like numbered outline where you're organizing your pieces of information based on how important they are to the lead. And you can move those things around to, so you have your lead at the top, and then you have your relevant information underneath. And after you gather most of this information, you want to ask yourself, what's missing? How can I improve this story? And the answer to those two questions will help you to focus your idea of who you should be interviewing. So, a little more about finding an interview. Not only should they be people that you are capable of reaching, but you also want to ask, what are they going to add to my story? So, again, going back to thinking about maybe a story about restaurants, if you talk to someone who is eating out in a restaurant, but they've never actually worked in one before, and the rest of your story talks about working in one, they might not have something relevant to say. However, if you are including some points about the restaurant experience, then including a couple of person on the street pieces of information, so some direct quotes with opinions, that kind of stuff can be helpful. So you want to find people with meaningful levels of involvement. Again, that can be someone with a first person account, whether it's for an event or someone with that primary source type of information where they study that field or work in that industry. And you also want to look for people who might be people of interest. For example, if you are doing a story about a rally, then you might look for the lead organizer of the rally and ask them, why they wanted to do this, what is it about, that kind of stuff. This is where also we might look for people with certain levels of fame, like politicians or public speakers, those kinds of people, entertainers as well. And then as I mentioned with the restaurant story idea, you can also include person on the street interviews. And these are also referred to as like everyday Joe type of opinions. And those those types of interviews can provide some really good some really good colorful additions to a story and help people to connect a little more with what's going on. All right, here's another scenario for you. You see a news story about Earth receiving a temporary mini moon. Who might you interview about this story? Okay, so now that you've had a second, of course, some people you might interview would be people maybe who work for NASA or who work for in astronomy or something like that. So they could give you some really good professional level interviews. Now, something that can be fun for these types of unusual stories where it is still something that you need to include facts about what's happening, but it can also be fun to include some person on the street interviews where where people are trying to guess what a term means or whether or not it's a real story to some of those can be entertaining, especially if you're working in broadcasting and collecting those like audio video pieces of material. All right, so let's look at some interview questions. Now, first of all, every time you begin an interview, whether you are working by yourself or working with a news organization or with a public relations group, what have you, you want to begin your interview by including the date of the interview and the topic you're going to cover. So this is a way of slugging the story and that, it's giving you that information right away so you know when this interview was collected and whether or not it's dated if you decide to include it in any future work. And when you include that type of information in like when you're naming your files and stuff too, that can help you to organize everything. And that way you don't accidentally throw something away that you really needed to. So after you do that, you ask your interviewee to say and spell their first and last name. Now, of course, you as the person who's contacted them should know their first and last name. However, it's good to have them say it for you and have it on tape. That way, if you're working on several projects at once and you don't completely remember what was going on, you won't accidentally misspeak or misspell it if you're writing a story. And same thing if you're working in with a group of people and someone else has to go back and edit your interview, you don't want them to have to dig through different files and things for 10 minutes to find the correct information. So we have date of the interview, topic covered, the person's first and last name, and we want their title and the name of their business or event. So basically, how are they connected to your story? Now, if it's one of those person on the street interviews, then of course this part isn't necessary really. You might include it if you're going to interview someone and it's a story related to students, then you might have them say like, yeah, I'm a junior at UL Lafayette or whatever it is that they are and wherever they go to school or that kind of stuff. Now, whenever you first go in to collect your interview, you also want to make sure that you have contact information. So you will almost definitely have something where you want to contact this person again, or at least you want to collect that information so your colleagues will be able to follow up with any questions they have if you're working with a group of people. So you want to make sure you have that contact information. That way, if you have any follow-up questions after the interview, if you need to maybe discuss something that is related in a later interview, like if you do a follow-up story or something, or if you maybe aren't talking about exactly the same topic, but you know this person would be very helpful, then you have their contact information and you're able to work on that next story much faster. Now, your interview questions should reflect your main topic. So make sure you're focusing on that main idea and also include the relationship of the interviewee and the topic in there. So think about how your person relates to the topic. Again, if we're collecting both professional and person on the street information, the person on the street interview, you wouldn't ask them any technical details about that particular topic. You would save those for the field expert instead. And whenever you're working on developing your questions, you want to have a combination of open-ended and close-ended questions. And as you continue with interviewing and everything, you'll get to a point where you understand how to develop those questions in more of a conversation format. But for now, let's look at how those open-ended and close-ended questions are created. So, first of all, open-ended questions, these are the ones you're asking to get detailed answers. This is something where maybe you can get that really quotable opinion statement that happens, or you'll get a better explanation than what you received in a press release or something else. So, you're looking to add, again, more information, build upon what you already have, or to provide more of an emotional image for your audience. Now, when we talk about closed-ended questions, these are the ones where you're looking for yes or no answers. So you want to clarify or nail down particular facts. For example, if you ask someone, were you home when the fire started? Well, then you're asking them, were they there? Some people will give you more than a yes or no for those types of questions, and that's great. Other people are very short answer type people. They don't want to give you a lot of information. So that's where asking those open-ended questions comes in. So if you ask someone, were you home when you started the fire? They say yes. And you say, maybe, when did you notice something was burning? And they might give you a little more information about it, or how did you get out of the house, that kind of thing. And of course, whenever you're asking your questions for your interviewee, don't be afraid to leave a little silence in there. Give them some breathing room to think about your questions and to respond. So, your questions should reflect your research. You want to write 5 or 6 questions based on what you've collected, and you want those questions to have a logical flow. However, you do want to stay flexible and listen to the person's answers. If they mention something that sounds interesting, don't be afraid to ask them some more questions about it. It's okay if you go off on a essentially a tangent, but you're still talking about the main topic that you came there to interview them about. So you can ask some follow-up questions, and sometimes these will be rephrased answers from your interviewee. So you take that piece of information that they've given you and maybe and change it into a question. Now, here's an example of rephrasing an interviewee's statement. If you ask them, what do you think about the hospital's new emergency room policy? And this person says, I hate it. Well, you want a little more clarification, right? So you would say, which aspects of the policy do you dislike so strongly? And it's possible that they will give you 1 or 2 examples, or maybe that will be the trigger to help them give you a little more information and clarity about what they dislike so much. Now, wrapping up your interview, whenever you've asked the questions that you need to ask, you followed up on the points that you thought were interesting and related to what you're discussing, either generally or specifically, then you ask them if there are any other important points that you missed, anything else that they want to add in there. And you can also ask them for other source recommendations. Now, this does depend on who you interview, and usually you can get a feel from someone whether or not they would be a good person to ask, like, hey, do you have any suggestions about other sources, maybe other people I can interview or places that I should search? Tell them, hey, I searched in X and Y, but what else do you have for me? And they say you should search in Alpha, and you'll say, okay, yeah, that sounds like a good addition to my sources. And of course, whenever you are conducting an interview, you want to make sure that the person you're interviewing speaks more than you do. Your goal, remember, is for them to answer your questions. You do not want to sit there for 20 minutes conducting an interview where you're the person talking for 15 of those 20 minutes. And for your projects in here and for any future interviews and things, you want to record your interviews. Now, Louisiana is a one-party consent state, and what that means is only one person in the group of people being recorded needs to know about the recording. So this is different between states. Some states are a multi-party consent state where you need to have everyone agreeing to being recorded. But again, over here in Louisiana, it's just one person who has to know about it. For example, if you and a friend are talking over lunch and you start recording something on your phone, you technically can record everything that's being said without breaking the law. However, just whenever you disclose that you're recording, you are also building trust with that person. You're telling them, hey, look, we're both reasonable people here, basically. And I want to make sure that I quote you correctly and include your information in context. So if you don't mind, I'm going to record this and include this information in my story. And one exclusion though to think about is there is a law against what's called voyeurism. So basically, you can't record people without their consent in places that are usually considered private, like locker rooms or bathrooms and stuff. Like you can't have video recordings and expect and post them online or something like that and expect that to be considered okay under the law or even ethically speaking. However, again, usually when we're talking about media writing and stuff, you aren't doing those kinds of things. And whenever you record audio or video, this also gives you a multimedia capability. So you're able to include maybe a short video clip of someone from your interview within your online article, or maybe you end up writing an article, but you also have a 2-minute story that you're posting that you're going to include on your radio station too. Now, you do have a lot of different options when it comes to recording. We have video recording, of course, and this could be something where you're recording in person, whether you're using a more traditional camera or if you're using your phone on a tripod or propped up on some books or something. You can also record people during a video chat, such as one on Zoom. Same thing with audio recording. You can record phone calls, you can record Zoom calls, you could even record audio in person instead of recording audio and video. And you do also have the option of asking people questions by email or by including transcripts of conversations as well. Those can be more text-based options that are available. And then you might include photos or other information in there. However, in here and elsewhere, it really is important to get some kind of either in person or phone or video chat option whenever you're conducting an interview, because even if you end up not recording it, because it gives you more information about the person. Are they being sarcastic? Are they being serious? What is their reaction whenever you ask them a particular question, that kind of thing. And you also want to look at different interview locations. Now, if you go outside somewhere like to a restaurant or a cafe, you have a lot of background noise to deal with. So it's usually better to go into a quieter location. This could be maybe recording in one of the private rooms in the library or going to your source, which is the best option usually. So when you can, you want to, and you feel comfortable doing that yourself, then you can go to your source's home or office and record them over there. So, one instance where you might go to someone's home is if you're doing a personal profile on someone. And that way you can see how they are at home as well as in their office. And not only does this provide a better background for that type of interview, but it also makes people more comfortable and more willing to discuss whatever the topic is. And they might even have some paperwork and things in their office that they didn't remember before, and they might not feel comfortable sending you a copy via email, but you can get that physical copy from them in person. Now, if you're covering breaking news events, then you will usually have to go to the scene of whatever it is that happened, whether you're covering inclement weather or if you're looking at some kind of crime or other emergency event. Then when you go over there, that's going to give your audience that additional background. It'll also make it easier often for you to find someone who's involved in your story, whether it's a public information officer or someone who is personally involved in that particular event. Okay, let's talk about writing from your interviews. So, you made your outline, you asked your questions, and now you're ready to fill in the gaps. So you want to look through your interviewees' responses and find any relevant information. Figure out which pieces are going to be most important to your audience. Are there any really compelling direct quotes? Are there some certain points where they just really explain something well and you feel like that would make a great direct quote in there? Or maybe you can paraphrase some of their information and it'll help to add on to the information you received from your other sources like press releases or website explanations. All right, so we have two different types of quotes. We have direct quotes and indirect quotes. And indirect quotes, again, those are things that are paraphrasing. That's another way of saying it. And the reason you would paraphrase something, first of all, if you're introducing an interviewee, you will need to summarize some of the information about them, help introduce them to your audience. Now, sometimes people do a really excellent job introducing themselves, and if you're working in broadcasting, whether it's conducting an interview for a podcast or maybe one for a news segment or something, you might include that as a direct quote too, but usually you'll be paraphrasing some information about your interviewee or about their main idea related to this particular topic. And another reason you're going to paraphrase is maybe they used a little too technical of language in their response. And so you want to make it easier for your audience to understand what this person said. So you could still include a direct quote from them, maybe to give that information first from this interviewee, and then paraphrase it where you're explaining a little more of the information. And finally, you can also use an indirect quote to help you transition between ideas. So maybe you introduce your story, you have your lead, that main idea about your topic, and then you have kind of a transition sentence where you're introducing your interviewee, and then you have a direct quote from them, and then you have another transition into another concept that they brought up. So, like I said, we also have direct quotes that might be used from a source, and this this type of thing is most often used when we have a very emotional statement from an interviewee. So something that where they said it and it was very compelling, and we feel like the audience would connect well with this particular moment from the interview. Also, if your interviewee just explained it really well in one or two sentences, then that is going to be a something that you want to include in their own words, because often the person you're interviewing, they're if they say it well, then their direct statement is going to be more compelling for your audience than an indirect quote where you're summarizing what this person said. So let's look at some examples of indirect and direct quotes. So first we have an example of paraphrasing. It says, "These short-lived mini-moons are likely more common than we realize," said Richard Binzel, an astronomer at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. "The last known one was detected in 2020." And then we have a direct quote. It says, quote, "This happens with some frequency, but we rarely see them because they're very small and very hard to detect, comma, close quotes, he said." So again, we have that attribution. And of course, since we introduced our person already, we're able to say he said, and we know that we mean Binzel. Open quotes. "Only recently has our survey capability reached the point of spotting them routinely, period, close quotes." So we have this person explaining to our audience why we only now are are recognizing these mini moons that happen in Earth's orbit. So, so we have again that paraphrased information where maybe Binzel answered this or provided this information in several little short spurts, and it just sounds better when we summarize it, or because we want to transition from another idea in the story into this direct quote from him where he gives us more specific information. All right, so that wraps up chapter 5. A reminder, you should start working on writing project 3, your interview, and you can find those instructions on Moodle.